The idea of a developmental model is that once I'm able to master the skill set, the mindset and the skill set of a particular stage, then I can see the world with more complexity. When folks have mastered the skill of being able to see other people's cultures as every bit as rich as their own, at least food, dance, etc., then what happens, the research indicates, that people enter an us and them place. Now, for some of us, that happened when we were very young. And we've moved beyond that and might not even remember that place. For some of us, that is where we spend our lives. So the us and them place in the model is called polarization. And there's two ways polarization manifests. And I'm going to talk about both of them. And I'm going to start with polarization defense. And I really want to spend some time here because the political moment we're in, certainly since the campaign started in 2015, the presidential campaign, has really elevated this particular mindset into more of our community conversations. So I want to spend some time really talking about what the stage is. The stage of polarization, as I said, is really manifest by an us and them, where we are better than them. It is the stage that can be from a place of explicit stereotypes and explicit biases to really, at the extreme of it, what we can think of as the hate groups, white supremacy, etc. One of the challenges is to really think about how much has this stage now got into our sort of collective consciousness or collective unconsciousness, and how much weight are we actually giving it. So let me describe a few things about polarization. As I said, polarization is an us versus them, where we are better than them. For folks whose primary orientation is in polarization defense, folks can see difference, but they are overemphasizing the difference and not finding any commonalities with people. And because the differences are overestimated, what tends to happen is that differences are always perceived as negative. If you're not one of me, then you're an us. And we are better than you, and you are a threat to our way of life. So what we often see from folks who are in polarization is the anger. What is underneath the anger is fear. And it's a fear that my way of life is going to be eroded by interaction, or that you are in our community, or that you are in our space. So it's a deep sense of anxiety and fear. A couple of characteristics of folks whose polarization is their primary mindset. One is that folks can really see difference, and anything that tries to counter their worldview, they see as threatening. So folks in polarization are really clear about their worldview and that their worldview is right. So what does that mean in terms of how we try to interact with folks in polarization? When we try to provide people whose primary mindset is polarization with information about what they have wrong. No, let me tell you what you've got wrong. Let me give you some data. Let me tell you really about how immigrants are coming across the border, whether they're legal or not, are helping our economy. Let me really tell you about what's happening with gun violence. Let me really tell you about the experience of women who have been sexually assaulted. Or let me really tell you about the experience of same-sex couples who previously had not gotten to me. We're asking them to take in information that counters their worldview. What happens when folks are in polarization are two things. One is they have response bias, meaning any data we give them, they're likely to only hear the pieces that already affirm their worldview. Let me give you an example. After the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, the Obama administration ordered a Department of Justice analysis. I happened to have been watching Rachel Maddow on MSNBC and the report came out. And she talked about the data and said, we now have data, we have evidence that the police in Ferguson were doing racial profiling. On my cable network, Fox is one station over, so inquiring minds want to know. So I flipped over to Fox, and they were talking about the exact same piece of data, and they said, we now have data that proves that African Americans are more likely to be criminals in Ferguson. So data is just data. Information is just information. We absorb it through our pre-existing mindset. And so one of the reasons that's really important is a lot of the anti-racism work we're doing is very data heavy. We'll just give people information and that's going to change their mind. That is only true for people in particular mindsets. So what we know about people in polarization is not only do they have response bias, but when we try to give them data that contradicts their worldview, they actually double down on their incorrect worldview, or we might think is incorrect. They double down on their pre-existing worldview, and they call anything now, what they do is call anything that contradicts their worldview fake news. What is the most effective way to interact with folks who are in polarization? The intercultural development model says that if folks are only seeing differences, remember intercultural competency is how do I hold differences and similarities? And if folks in this mindset are only seeing differences and we're trying to tell them, here's more data about people who are different, here's more data about people who are different, what it's going to do is reinforce their sense of difference. And along with that, bias, stereotypes, etc. So what we need to do instead is help folks see commonalities where they think none exist, which is sometimes really challenging for us, because if we're not in this developmental stage, we really want to point out what you got wrong. And so this is one of those moments where the developmental model is super helpful for me, because it keeps me asking the question in this moment, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective? And I get to that choice. There are sometimes I want to be right and I just want to tell them how wrong they are. If my goal is to help me feel more empowered and for me to feel better, okay, it does make a difference whether or not I've impacted somebody else or moved the congregation along in a certain way. But if my goal is to actually engage my fellow congregants in a conversation to move the congregation further towards equity, then I might need to think about, if I'm trying to get people who don't see anything outside their own frame of reference to actually have a sense of connection, to be able to see commonalities with these people that they're making other, maybe I need a different strategy. And the strategy really is how to help people find commonalities across difference. So maybe what I'm going to engage in is really some storytelling. So let's say I'm trying to move the congregation around understanding something about immigration in DACA. So rather than giving them all kinds of information and about how racist they might be about that and trying to sort of prove my point, maybe what I need to do is really ask people to dig deep into what they might have in common with the DACA recipients or some of the immigrants that are in their community. Maybe we'll ask people to tell their own immigration stories. One of the organizations I'm working with right now does this in a brilliant way. I've been doing some work with Twin Cities Habitat, and some of the congregations might be involved in Habitat's projects in their own communities. And Twin Cities Habitat talks about that as the theology of the hammer. What they do is bring people together, working side by side on something they can create together. They're not having a lot of structured conversation about difference. They're just creating something together. And in the process of creating something together, finding out something about their humanity. And when folks are in that stage of polarization, that is really the important thing to do. Share stories, have people work together on something. We are living in a time right now where polarization is sort of the political discourse. And so a couple of things I just want to say about that. One is the data we have is that really only about 15 to 16% of the population are primarily in polarization defense as their primary worldview. And I think that's really important for those of us to remember, because we can see the news, we can hear what's happening out in the world and believe that it's everybody. And I personally, just for my own sanity, have to remember those are the voices that are loudest right now, but really that's not everybody. The data would suggest there's at least 75% of folks who are open to mobilization around diversity, inclusion, equity, if we can figure out how to mobilize them in the most effective way. The other thing I'd say for those of us who are not in polarization, who care about diversity, inclusion, equity, is that the current political conversation in polarization can really traumatize us. in my work as a therapist, we used to talk about it as post-traumatic stress. I think right now for many of us, we're living in a time of persistent traumatic stress. And one of the things just to be aware of as we're thinking about trauma is that there are really two real ways that our bodies deal with trauma. One is hypervigilance. We're paying attention to everything. We can't turn off the news. We can't get off Facebook. And all of that is making sort of our nervous systems fire more and more and more, which has its own stress connected to it. The other thing that happens sometimes is we just get overwhelmed and we shut down and go numb. So I would just encourage folks as they're thinking about their own work around equity to pay attention to those two. And I just offer these suggestions about how to deal with folks in polarization as another option. It's a way to sort of feel more empowered in the midst of trauma.